Vice President, Your Excellencies, fellow aldermen, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Guildhall. I'm especially pleased to welcome Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Dombrovskis, to the city today. Unfortunately, the budget debate in the Latvian Parliament has kept the Prime Minister, Karins, busy in Riga, but we look forward to welcoming him to one of our future discussions. Today we are here to talk about sustainability, a topic which has topped and tailed my first week in office. On Tuesday morning, I attended a plastic-free city event at Rothschild & Co. in the city, encouraging city businesses to rethink the way they use plastic. And today I'm here with you to understand what more the financial sector can do to create a more sustainable world. From the powerful actions of young activists like Greta Thunberg to the devastating images of melting ice caps, sustainability is an emotive issue that has been hard to escape. But the climate change is much more than media fanfare. According to the UN, it is one of the most pervasive and threatening crises of our time. If temperatures continue to increase, we risk creating an uninhabitable world for future generations. For these reasons, in 2016, 175 world leaders signed the Paris Agreement, committing to accelerating action and investment to create a low-carbon future. In 2018, the European Union took this a step further, promising to become the first major economy to go climate neutral by 2050. Under this plan, emissions of greenhouse gases after 2050 would need to be offset by other means. And earlier this year, the UK government matched this push, becoming the first major economy to put into law its commitment to be climate neutral by 2050. These are all encouraging steps, followed last week by another. We were delighted to hear, Vice President, of your announcement that the European Commission will be looking into offering banks regulatory relief for green investments. As the world's leading financial centre, the city is equally committed to leading the financial services sector into a new era of sustainable finance. We want to work with scientists, learning what they need from financial services and equally teaching them the language of finance, so we can create workable, sustainable products and services. And most importantly, we want to work internationally. Climate change knows no borders, and therefore it's important we are encouraging economies across the world to provide sustainable financing. We need to meet markets where they're at and engage with the sectors, economies and jurisdictions that are most in need of change, using everything in our arsenal to provide the incentives needed to fund low or neutral carbon solutions and assets. One way we are working to do this in the UK is through the Green Finance Institute. Launched earlier this year, the Institute seeks to mobilise capital to support the world's transition to a zero-carbon and climate-resilient economy. Working with international partners such as Brazil and China, and incorporating a variety of stakeholders, from economists to members of government to scientists, we want to create truly viable and sustainable financial solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all aware that mitigating against climate change will be a tall task, one which will require the backing and support of every individual, every industry, and every nation across our planet. Through being here today, you are demonstrating that support, signalling your commitment, and more broadly, the financial sector's commitment to creating a global, low-carbon economy. Thank you to the Latvian Embassy, especially Ambassador BRAŽE, for bringing us together today. On behalf of the city, we look forward to working with you all to find new financial solutions to sustainable problems, ensuring the financial services sector is playing its part in fighting the climate crisis and securing the world's future. Thank you.
So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Her Excellency the Ambassador from Latvia to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like first to thank the Lord Mayor and the Chair of the Policy Committee of the city for their warm welcome. Second, my best greetings from our Prime Minister, Mr. Karinš, who was pleased to know that it's not only the UK's Parliament that sticks its foot to the ground, but it was also Latvian Parliament who actually, instead of 24 hours, took more than 48 hours to discuss the budget. Late last night it was passed, so we are good. There is government. It's the same government. The Prime Minister has asked me to make a few remarks on behalf of Latvia, and I think this event is actually quite perfect in seeing how the silos are overcome. I'll speak on behalf of a government member of the EU. We will have Commission's Vice President speaking on behalf of the institutions, and we have the private sector right here, and also the media, and also some of the civil society institutions. So, first, once we look at the wider picture, of course, we all in the West understand that we will have to manage some big disruptions. And these big disruptions will have to be managed jointly by all these sectors. There is no more silo thinking in this world. When we look at these major disruptions, be it state and non-state actors undermining rules-based international system, be it technology, be it climate change, be it migration, they all can only be managed together. And we have to come out on the other end, if there is the other end, stronger, more knowledgeable, and more united. So the answer on the Latvian side is that we have chosen to manage these disruptions within the groups of like-minded states. EU, NATO, OECD, WTO, UN, and other multilateral institutions that are based on rules that we have all voluntarily agreed upon and are implementing in the best way. We think it's more efficient, it scales our sovereignty, increases sovereignty, scales the power, and projects the joint interests across the globe. And again, be it on climate, be it on technology, be it on deterring hard security threats, trade, or adjusting taxation to modern-day realities. All these tasks are better achieved and projected globally within these groups of states. When we look globally, there are three big regulatory areas, three big regulators, EU, US, and China. And it will be up to each and every one to decide which of these areas increases their scale, increases their power globally. For us, the answer is clear. On regulation, it's the EU. EU sets the golden standards globally, be it on privacy, be it on data, and the new Commission will have very important initiatives in all this respect. On climate, we have chosen to respond within the EU by setting out ambitious aims, such as climate neutrality by 2050, while underpinning these aims with concrete policies and instruments, shaping joint national and global response. Here again, overcoming the silos between the private sector, civil society, academia is crucial in achieving success. Governments alone will not be able to succeed. Latvia is among 16 member states to support 25% of the EU multi-annual framework spending on fighting climate change. But we do recognize that even more will have to be spent in future. Our climate goals in Latvia by 2030 significantly exceeds EU average. We are dedicated for our economy to become carbon neutral by 2050. It will cost a lot of money. We know it. But there is no other way. On green finance, we fully support Commission's ambition and the work that has been done this far. And in our view, all three components are equally important: environmental, social, and governance, to ensure sustainable development of our economy, but of all the economies globally. Again, this is setting the new global standard. Obviously, there are practical challenges: quantification of climate risks, unified criteria for what to recognize as green projects. Terms such as greenwashing will soon be an everyday household name, I guess. In our view, the solution again is as unified as possible EU standards, taxonomy, better data exchange among actors in financial sector, and B2G, business to government. In Latvia, lion's share of businesses are small, medium-sized enterprises, and in their financing, they rely solely, or almost solely, on banks. Similarly to, I guess, many other EU states. So the financial sector will be the driving force behind this change. Already now we see that our financial sector is a frontrunner in introducing new technologies and financing mechanisms, thus facilitating sustainability. For example, a highly successful green bond is being issued by our national state financing agency, Altum. Demand in the Baltics currently far significantly exceeds supply for this. Altum has also been actively issuing ESCO loans for implementation of various green and innovative projects, filling the gaps of conventional banks. For example, for renewables and industrial sector, solar applications for energy generation, for energy efficiency, lighting, and industrial efficiency. Today, Latvia is a leader in the EU in energy efficiency savings, and that in turn has stimulated also other industries becoming secondary and tertiary beneficiaries. For example, in passive and wood housing, smart bioeconomy, these construction companies are also active here in the UK. Or, for example, on Internet of Things, for technology applications in energy efficiency, companies such as Saftechnica, Istabai, they are looking also at the UK market. Going back and looking at the stage where we are, and in conclusion, let me be clear, it is in the interest of all that these disruptions that give so many opportunities when they are unregulated are guided in such a way that strengthens the rule of law and benefit our societies. So, standard setting, smart regulation, bona fide compliance is the way to proceed. No rules, no accountability world will be the opposite, as we remember from financial crisis just 10 years ago. And while doing that within the established groups of state and institutions, the private sector needs to be on board. Business is a major force for growth and impact. However, they can also cause disruptions. The private sector needs to take responsibility to work with governments and all other sectors to create a workable governance sector which ensures a shared responsibility. Thank you for your attention, and I would like now to introduce Mr. Valdis DOMBROVSKIS, probably the most influential Latvian in the world, Vice President of the European Commission, and with the most substantive portfolio whenever the new Commission starts work. And he's been Prime Minister of Latvia, is one of the most respected politicians in Latvia, and led us out of the crisis successfully. So he's best placed also for the whole of the EU to lead us in the age of disruptions and come out successfully from it. Thank you.
Honourable Lord Mayor, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Global politics tend not to be simple or certain, and we are living in uncertain time. We used to think of the world moving on a path towards greater democracy, more open markets and peaceful international cooperation. This is no longer the case. Significant challenges face us from the more insecure world right on our doorstep. Trade tensions have escalated, lowering growth prospects for the global economy. The multilateral rules-based order has been weakened. The international trading system has become less open. There are significant broader issues to tackle as well, both in Europe and globally. Climate change, digitalization, aging societies, just to name a few. For the new European Commission, the next 5 years will be about managing these issues effectively and fairly. As President-elect Ursula von der Leyen has said, Europe must lead the transition to the carbon-neutral economy and new digital world. To achieve that, economic, social and sustainable aspects all go hand in hand. For my own area of responsibility, this calls for a robust and risk-protected financial system underpinned by healthy, resilient national economies. And it means continuing our work in deepening economic and monetary union. In the previous mandate, we made significant progress on the banking union and the capital markets union. Both projects will also be important priorities for the next Commission. Europe's banking sector is on much more solid footing than when we faced the last major financial crisis a decade ago. However, now it's time to complete the banking union. In particular, we need to agree on the common deposit insurance scheme, the third pillar of the banking union, to give it stronger and more uniform insurance cover. With the capital markets union, we have secured agreement for 11 out of 13 proposals presented by the Commission, with the 12th likely to come this year. So one could say that the basic building blocks are now in place. Still, the next Commission plans to raise its ambition and push further. I think we first need to reflect and consult further on long-term traits affecting where to go next with this flagship project. This is why the Commission will bring together experts from industry and civil societies to discuss these elements in a high-level forum on capital markets. It should present recommendations for the Commission in its work for the next strategy for the capital markets union. Our small and medium-sized businesses also need to see CMU completed. All too often, SMEs move abroad to scale up because they find it difficult to get market-based financing here in Europe. As part of our work to make sure that SMEs can access capital markets everywhere in a single market, I will propose a new fund to help them to go public. Supporting the development of local and regional capital markets will remain a focus. They are the basis for deeper cross-border markets in Europe. In my own part of Europe, Latvia and its Baltic neighbors provide a good example. They plan to create a pan-Baltic capital market as a pioneering project, which I warmly encourage. The Commission already provides it with technical support and strongly supports cross-border initiatives such as this. It is also important to ensure the integrity of Europe's financial sector so that it cannot be undermined. With this in mind, President-elect von der Leyen has entrusted me with leading the fight against money laundering. This is a task which I take very seriously. There is no place for dirty money in Europe's banks. While Europe has some of the world's toughest rules against money laundering, we need to strengthen supervision and enforcement, including across borders. I would see a lot of merit in conferring specific anti-money laundering supervisory tasks and their coordination to the EU body. Ladies and gentlemen, at the start I mentioned major challenges that will top our political agenda for the next 5 years, namely the green and digital transformations. How best to manage them, how to prepare our economies and societies, and how to make the most of them for all to benefit with nobody left behind. So now I will turn the focus to the main focus of today, sustainable finance. The EU is a global leader in this area, the first jurisdiction to pass hard law to incentivize capital flows to green and sustainable projects. To finance the transition to the climate-neutral economy, Europe needs massive investment, trillions of euros over the next decades. We will need both public and private funding to pay for everything from small-scale energy efficiencies and innovative low-carbon transport systems to large sustainable investment projects. The new Commission will draw up a Sustainable Europe investment plan to unlock 1 trillion euros of sustainable investment over the next decade. To stimulate private investment, we should create right regulatory incentives. We have also incorporated sustainability across all policy areas in the EU's next long-term budget from 2021 to 2027, which we will use to also to leverage private investment. So at least 25% of EU budget should contribute to sustainability goals. We will also work with the European Investment Bank so that by 2025, at least half of its financing will be dedicated to climate action projects, double what it is now. On the regulatory side, we have agreed disclosure rules for financial market operators and also climate benchmarks. We are moving quickly with negotiations for an EU classification system or taxonomy to define which economic activities are sustainable. Soon we will start preparing another set of green finance initiatives. These could include incentivizing tools like green mortgage loans and expanding the EU eco-label to financial products. We will work on EU green bond standards, which could support local and regional authorities and also SMEs to issue bonds to assist in setting up sustainable projects. Then, on the reporting side, we will propose measures in the EU's non-financial reporting directive and ask companies to give sufficient and reliable information on their sustainability risks and opportunities. A transformation of this scale will affect everyone and cause immense change in our societies. But it must not come at the cost of the most vulnerable. It must be socially fair transition without increasing poverty, inequality, or social exclusion. We will support these most affected by the green transformation through a new Just Transition Fund. Europe faces another transformation that is already well underway, a digital transformation. It has major effect on financial services as we know them today. Financial innovation and digitization of financial services are a priority given the huge potential that new technologies bring to the financial sector. For example, by giving consumers better and faster access to finance. We will present a new strategy for Europe to get the best out of fintech and to compete globally as we remove regulatory barriers between countries. Of course, we will make sure to address risks related to consumer protection, money laundering and terrorist financing, data protection, to give just some examples. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I have given you a flavor from the European Commission's perspective of what the next 5 years may hold for Europe's financial sector, particularly for sustainable finance. When it comes to considering knowns and unknowns, up to the point we can prepare. But as ever, we have to be ready for unexpected and its impact. There is still uncertainty about Brexit. Let me be clear, the UK's departure is a loss for the EU. We share joint history and geopolitical interests. So we regret this decision, but we respect it. In this case, it's important to ensure that the withdrawal takes place in an orderly way. That is why withdrawal agreement agreed between the UK and between the EU and the UK government in October is so important, and we hope ratification can happen soon. In my area of responsibility, preserving financial stability remains a top priority and shared objective both for the EU and the UK. We have already worked together to minimize financial stability risks. We have pressed and continue to press firms to prepare for all outcomes. We have worked together under the chairmanship of Mario Draghi and Mark Carney to identify and mitigate stability risks related to Brexit. As you know, central clearing has been identified as a clear systemic risk in a case of no-deal Brexit. The Commission addressed it last year via a temporary equivalence decision. This will expire on 30th of March 2020. Regrettably, the risk to the financial stability has not yet been fully removed because industry has not so far fully prepared. Therefore, I intend to propose to renew this time-limited equivalence decision beyond that date to prepare for any eventuality. Ladies and gentlemen, resilience will remain the name of the game for the financial sector. And we need a resilient and stable financial sector, not only to finance innovation, investment and the competitiveness of our continent, but also to play its part in one of the history's biggest transformations, the transition to the carbon-neutral economy. Thank you very much, and I look forward for the discussion. Thank you.
To move on to the panel. The panel heads the discussion, Financial Service Industry Perspectives on an EU Action Plan for Sustainable Finance, which the Vice President has just outlined. May I immediately say that Valdis is not only the most important Latvian in Latvia, probably in this area, but he's also extremely important for the development of green and sustainable finance, probably the most influential Latvian person in the world there too. May I immediately pay tribute to the fantastic work that the EU has been doing in this space. I would point out they have done it with many UK colleagues alongside, but be that as it may, there's been really important work done there, and I think the EU as a driver here, with the uncertainties that exist around the States and in China, is a really important leadership. So, Valdis, thank you very much indeed for that. We are going to talk about the perspectives on the EU Action Plan. I ought to introduce myself. Sorry, it says here, introduce yourself. My name is Roger Gifford. I chair the Green Finance Institute, which the Lord Mayor referred to earlier. This is our new institute set up this summer to act as the primary interface between public and private sectors to find commercial solutions to change, in particular around green finance in the sustainability area. So it's a very exciting new venture. Dr. Rhian Marie Thomas is its first Chief Executive, a capital markets banker from Barclays Bank, and we are optimistic for what it can achieve in exactly the areas, Valdis, that you wish to see promoted. So may I ask to the stage immediately Ambassador Baiba, thank you very much for your earlier talk, and to Rebecca Self and to Steffen HÖRTER to help us in our discussion around this subject. Asking you, you are the CFO of for sustainable finance at HSBC. HSBC is an absolute leader in the area of sustainable finance. And what do you think about this new initiative that the Vice President has been promoting?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here today. So maybe a few comments. Firstly, sustainable finance, huge opportunity for growth, and very much welcome the initiative being announced today. From an HSBC perspective, sustainable finance is now $40 billion US. That's since early 2017, and it covers a number of different areas. Green bonds, which you've heard about, sustainable development goals, and impact funds. And I think this is a really big area for a number of different corporates, those we bank, and across the EU. But it's not without challenges. And some of the challenges which have already been touched on relate to data, consistent definitions, and disclosures. And in this respect, the taxonomy, which we've heard about already, will be helpful. And having those consistent definitions, which we can all work towards, is something to be welcomed. When we look through our own corporates that we lend to, we do see some of those gaps, particularly with carbon data and greenhouse gas emissions data. And if we are to achieve the Paris Agreement collectively. There are really key initiatives like the Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which are also really important and supported by Mark Carney and lots of work by the Bank of England. So welcome the initiatives, and I would characterise sustainable finance as progress, but lots more to do.
Thank you very much. Well, that's optimistic and yet also ambitious. Steffen, you are the Global Head of ESG at Allianz Global Investors. I think you've been active in this space since at least the very first Global Equity Sustainability Fund in 1999. So all this stuff, this amazing amount of revolution that we're currently having around green finance, it's a rather old hat for you, isn't it? What do you think about these latest developments?
Well, the speed and the magnitude of mainstreaming sustainable finance has surprised, I guess, everyone who's been active in that area for a long time. And I have a couple of different heads. So as Global Head of ESG, I'm in charge of integrating sustainability into our investment strategies from Allianz Global Investors. And it's become mainstream. And we do that, and like many others, really to improve financial performance. And ideally also to achieve a real-world impact, to improve environment and social. On the other hand, the other hat I have as a member of the Technical Expert Group for Sustainable Finance, the signal that has been sent out by the Sustainable Finance Action Plan has been enormous, and also by a lot of initiatives like here in Britain. So I think for me it's important to see that it covers the full value chain. It starts with the corporate, from the corporate issue side. Climate data is a key topic, but also a lot of other sustainability data, to be honest. It goes to the asset owner, like pension funds, those with a long-term investment perspective, insurance companies. It goes to data providers, benchmark providers. It goes to the point of sale. So as you may have heard, starting potentially Q1 2021, at the point of sales, an IFA bank, but also in the institutional sales, you have to have a compulsory question in the EU whether the client has a sustainability preference. And our clients, our distributors, are already discussing heavily with us how to prepare for that. And it's a big opportunity. So I think it's an opportunity, and my point is it's an opportunity to build growth, to build wealth for everyone. And that's not to be underestimated.
I mean, it gets complicated, doesn't it? I mean, what is a wonderful language and a wonderful discussion at one level, when it comes down to the actual detail required to make real change in society, it gets complicated.
I think on the one hand, I think what needs to be done is to simplify. So perfection is the enemy of the good. And I think, you can always find problems, issues, challenges in whatever you do, and this is something new. I mean, we're talking about a massive transformation of the economy. The EU and Britain aim for a carbon neutral economy, the EU by 2050. That means that is a massive effort needed in the real economy sector to change business strategy, to prepare, to innovate. And I think here I would step back from complication more to opportunity, and point everybody in the real industry that there is an opportunity. So for British companies, for continental European companies, innovating in low carbon technology, which needs strong innovation, there is a global market waiting for you, and for many other sustainability products.
Perhaps, Ambassador, Vice President, this is exactly what you were pointing to as the need for a framework and the need for kind of guidance from the very top in this area. Can you talk to us a little bit about the taxonomy and the timing for that, and when we're going to see the kind of the hard principle, hard guidelines, hard regulation even come into the system?
Yeah. So as regards our work on taxonomy, taxonomy has been one of the 3 legislative proposals which we put forward in the context of our current Sustainable Finance Action Plan. So 2 proposals on benchmarks and disclosures are already agreed. And currently we are at, I would say, advanced stage of negotiations on taxonomy. And I hope that agreement between EU co-legislators can be reached still this year. Well, to be clear, what we are currently talking, it's, I would say, governance framework of the taxonomy. And once we have this governance framework in place, we will have then to put out the actual taxonomies. But the way we have organized our work was that not to have it all sequential and, losing time on this. In a sense, we had been preparing in parallel. So we still have a technical expert group working on number of elements of our Sustainable Finance Action Plan, including on taxonomy. So I would say our thinking of the taxonomy is already fairly developed. So once we have government framework in place, we will be able to move fast with the actual taxonomies, because lots of preparatory work has already been done. There is one risk which I would also mention, which was also mentioned, that perfect is enemy of the good. So what we should avoid the scenario is that now we try to create some kind of super taxonomy covering all possible areas and all aspects. We need to start gradually and then move forward. So the intention is to start first with the climate mitigation taxonomies, and then we can expand in other areas. For example, technical expert group has identified 6 environmental areas like climate mitigation, climate adaptation, circular economy, marine ecosystems, biodiversity, to mention some. Potentially we can move then into social and governance areas, but the important thing is not to try to create it all now, otherwise we can find ourselves 3 years down the road still discussing it all, but actually to get going now and then evolve our thinking and develop different taxonomies in a gradual way. But already with climate mitigation taxonomy would provide much needed clarity for the financial sector, which then would enable it also for retail sector, because based on this we can also work, for example, as I was mentioning, on EU eco-label on financial services. We can set green bond standards more clearly and to avoid greenwashing in more general. So to summarize, I am hopeful that we can reach political agreement still this year, and then we are able to start putting out taxonomies actually fairly soon.
So maybe first quarter of next year we should see something hard coming into practice.
Yes, that's, as we tend to say in Commission, that's ambitious but realistic.
I think whether to be realistic rather than ambitious. Anyway, but
that's
very good to hear. I mean, I think it's fair to say the EU has been a leader in the field of greening finance. China has been extraordinarily vocal and active, and yet we know also there's huge energy demands which require brown fuel still being used there. The United States, I think a huge amount is happening. There's a lot happening in individual states, particularly New York, California, and all over. There's a turning away from coal towards natural gas, but also towards wind farm and solar. So there's a revolution happening there, but the senior levels of the United States are not currently playing the rhetoric game, if you like. They are certainly also look as though they may be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. What's your reaction to that, and just as a kind of gut reaction?
Well, first of all, if we talk sustainable finance, of course, it's important that this is not only EU effort, but it's a global effort. So, after all, EU produces only around 9% of the global emissions. So clearly we need to get rest of the world on board. That's why EU launched this initiative on international platform of sustainable finance to agree with other jurisdictions and to coordinate our approach to avoid, if you want market proliferation, market fragmentation, avoid different standards in different countries which may be conflicting. So to the extent possible we need a coordinated approach. So that's why last month we launched international platform on sustainable finance. It's at this stage, so it's EU representing 28 countries, and it's Argentina, Canada, Chile, China, India, Kenya, and Morocco, and it's open for other countries to join. So we're working with other countries which potentially will be joining this international platform on sustainable finance. So, well, as you see, China is on board with this initiative. US is not on board because, yes, we know what is the approach currently of the US president in this matter, but still we see lots of interest from US states, from cities which are willing to do their part in fighting the climate change. So one can say that it's also in case of US, the case is not lost, even though central government is not interested. There are states and cities which are doing their part.
Absolutely. Ambassador, could I ask you, from your perspective, sitting here in London, observing what the UK has been doing in the green space and what the, even forgetting about whether Brexit happens or not, or forgetting that direction, what do you think are the main wins for the EU in playing a global coordinating role here? Is it going to be possible? Is it going to become a them and us?
Well, Brexit is a disruption in this respect because, of course, when we speak about the scale, of projection of power of the EU globally and the standards, of course, UK comes as an important player within the EU, both with its knowledge, with its number of people, with its companies and everything. But for Latvia, I think all three elements of sustainable finance are important when we look at regulation globally and cooperation globally. So not only is the green per se, but also the environment, not only the environment per se, but also social and governance standards. And I think that will be the challenge with some other countries and some other regions outside of Europe. So, and there, obviously, the Commission is the one leading the work, and we do hopes that we achieve the situation where these standards are implemented globally. When it's a national issue, of course, we are a small and very flexible economy, and our interest is to have the regulations that is smart and applicable where our SMEs can easily scale up without moving anywhere, just as Vice President said. And in the same time, again, that the new regulation does provide opportunities instead of just burden. So I think that is how we see it on our side.
I think there's a very interesting discussion here about guidelines versus regulations. And actually, I think you'll find many market practitioners, I'd like to ask Rebecca and Steffen about this in a moment, would actually argue for stricter regulations as opposed to guidelines which can very often be soft. TCFD is an example in point. Why isn't TCFD mandatory now? It'd be easier, we're all heading in that direction. And yet we're still in the state of, well, it should be, let's be reasonable to the corporates here, let's not overburden them with costs in the TCFD area. So we might come onto that in a moment. But Valdis, before we'll move on, I was very interested in the new international platform on sustainable finance. Could you mention a word about that? Because I'm sure we'll all be involved in that.
Yeah, well, I actually already talked on this international platform of sustainable finance because that's important initiative to move ahead with the sustainable finance internationally. So it's already launched. We have currently EU on board. Of course, we will have to see what happens post-Brexit, but certainly would like that UK then continues to be part of the international platform of sustainable finance as a third country, because there had been also many UK players which had been very vocal in area of sustainable finance. To mention just one name, Mark Carney, working on exactly on the question you just raised on disclosures on non-financial reporting. On this, maybe to add some points, one of the elements of our next action plan on sustainable finance, we will be looking also at non-financial reporting directive, and indeed we are looking in the direction to making those reporting requirements more compulsory. So to see in which areas it's justified to move from guidelines, non-binding guidelines as it's now, to more compulsory reporting standards.
Thank you. Steffen, I'm going to immediately turn that back to you and ask you whether or not, and I think, to put it another way, I think many asset managers that we speak to, they say that they actually, a lot of their portfolios would not meet the taxonomy today. They wouldn't pass it because it's... and the question is really, does the taxonomy actually support the transition? Does it meet the market where it currently stands? Or is it really just governing financial flows that would have happened anyway? Is this a trend that you're seeing there, or is actually the taxonomy of significant use here?
Well, I think the taxonomy, of course, is the holy grail of the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, if you want to call it, because it connects the real economy, so it evaluates economic activities with sustainability. And in the end, I mean, what the taxonomy aims to achieve is, in the best case, minimize transaction costs, build a point of reference for financial market actors. I mean, if anything, financial market actors like investors want standards, especially in the bond market. So the EU Green Bond Standards link to the taxonomy, for example. So that's very, I think, useful and very welcomed by the financial industry. The point here is that I think you need to give it a bit more time. So, you know, we've been developing that, I think, in quite a fairly short time frame for good reasons. And it is at a starting point, and I think a whole ecosystem needs to evolve around taxonomy. So what I mean by ecosystem is what Mr. Dombrovskis mentioned, for example, to add the other environmental objectives, so whether it's circular economy, protection of maritime waters, protection of biodiversity, and so forth. Not only climate mitigation and adaptation, while those obviously are two that need immediate, attention. Yeah? The other part is you need to have data providers, because it will take corporates some time to disclose. Again, here we have to think about, we want more data, but we need to give corporates a bit of time to prepare, also to educate themselves on taxonomy. How does it work? What does do no significant harm mean? So you aim to meet the taxonomy objective, but you may harm other objectives. So you mentioned complication. I think complication is also a matter of perception. You got to make yourself familiar with those new developments. You got to train yourself, but that must not be underestimated, whether it's us as investors or corporates. Ecosystem also means you need to have verifiers on taxonomy disclosure, whether they are auditors or EU-certified verifiers. I think that's detailed. In the end, if everything works out, of course, you may achieve what the EU and Britain and many others globally want to achieve, to shift a lot of money into sustainable investments to facilitate the transformation which is required.
Well, if we turn now to the future and the requirements that we have going forwards, the amount of money that is supposedly looking for ESG, but specifically for climate resilient investments, is absolutely enormous. And as a banker, I must say, Rebecca, I'm going to ask you a question in a moment. As a banker, I must say it's very hard very often to find sufficiently robust, well-defined green projects to invest in. A wind farm is fairly obvious, a solar panel, yes, it's obvious. When you get beyond that into the areas of housing or manufacturing or cement or steel, some of the big industries, how do you begin to approach that? Particularly as a banker, there are trillions required out there. But where's it going to come from? How are you going to get it together?
Yeah, good question. If I may also just touch on the point on taxonomy and global consistency, which is really important in this area, and just a practitioner point. So looking at HSBC's disclosures, we have almost hundreds of different definitions, disclosure requirements, standards, pretty much by each individual country, stock exchange, and that makes it really challenging as a multinational to look at all of these various inconsistent standards. So one request there is for greater alignment, and there are projects underway like the corporate reporting dialogue, which brings a number of sustainability standard setters together to align under the framework of TCFD, the climate standards. And I think that alignment is really important to encourage more disclosure in this area. And then coming to your other question, again, it links back to definitions. It's looking for those opportunities, but there will be a mix. As you said, some of the very strict green opportunities are relatively straightforward to find. We have international green bond standards with different sectors on energy efficiency, on renewables, so those are available. But what's starting to emerge is also transition, and looking at some of those transition sectors or harder to abate sectors. And there the definitions are much more nuanced and the type of opportunities are much more nuanced. And so I think that's one thing that I'm looking to now is analysing not only the green, but also these transition opportunities, and that's much more complex.
So transition bonds in particular, I guess.
Exactly.
Yes. What the EU taxonomy would call light green.
Could be.
Yes. Now, there was a recent very interesting issue for TK tankers, and this was for 4 new tankers which are moving from 3% dirty crude to LNG with noxious fume capture, and it was categorised as light green. And if the whole of the shipping industry took this over, it would reduce again a significant proportion of the world's percentage of carbon dioxide emitted, because so much of our trade still goes by sea, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So we need shipping, we need a good solution for shipping. That was classified as light green. A little bit controversial because the 4 ships were all oil tankers, but I mean, that apart, it was clearly a very good source of energy. Valdis, yes?
Yeah, maybe a couple of words on those transition activities. Of course, it has been also part of the picture which has been taken into account when developing taxonomy. So basically we're looking at, so to say, green activities. As we discussed, we're looking also at transition and enabling activities. So transition activities, you already mentioned some of the examples. There may be transition activities in energy-intensive sectors like steel or cement, for example, which are energy-intensive industries. So transition activity there is a project with emission levels substantially below industry average. In this case, it can say it's okay, it helps to transition this energy-intensive sector to become less polluting, because, well, we still need steel and cement. And there is also, well, if you want, other kind of transition activities which may be phased out then later. For example, when we now look at the Paris goals on reduction of emissions, if we displace coal with natural gas, it can bring substantial emission reductions. But it may well be that then natural gas as a fossil fuel will not be part of the overall picture some decades down the road when we'll be aiming at carbon neutrality. But it may help for a transition period. And as regards enabling activities, say those wind parks have been mentioned, but then there has to be factories and value chains where those wind farms and turbines and whatever are being produced. So it's in a sense enabling activity which then allows us to move from fossil to renewable energy. So we're looking also at this more gradual picture, if you want, on what is green in a sense already, what is transition, what is enabling.
At the end of the day, it's going to be the banks and the institutions that will make the investments and get the finance together. So just remember where the real power lies in the long run, Vice President. But I would like to...
But Roger, it will be governments who will have to be elected and re-elected.
Yeah, we need governments too. Yeah.
Just think about it when you have to achieve a climate goal that is more ambitious than the average of the EU.
Going to be
and you know, how do you get there?
It's going to be a glorious harmony between us all, I'm absolutely sure. But Steffen, could I particularly come to you? I would like to know from your perspective, is ESG, is it developing fast enough? Are we getting enough clarity around the investments you can make? Do you feel, as an institutional investor, as a major investor in stocks with a lot to contribute going forward, do you feel you have enough opportunity and enough clarity around the ambitions of the investments that you're able to make?
So I think one point I'd like to echo is that obviously with all the effort around shifting trillions and not millions into green, you have to take account of the point that any financial institution only invests when it's convinced about the return in line with risk. So I think that part is important to highlight. So what should not happen is pushing somebody into something that is not performing financially. So everything needs to be balanced. So we have a fiduciary duty as an asset manager. The bank has a duty towards its shareholders not to overload the loan portfolio with non-performing loans and so forth. So that needs to be balanced. Now, I think a point that where also the EU, and I'm sure Britain is working on, is open up a project stream in the real economy. So I know there is initiatives. So what we need is to open up a stream of public-private partnerships. So that asset class is highly interesting. It is aimed at delivering stable financial returns, cash flows. That's what long-term investors are looking for at moderate risks. And we need substitutes because we are working in an environment of very low interest rates, if not negative rates, right? So there's a win-win, if you want to call it like this. But opening up that stream is important. So here, again, I think what needs to be avoided is a crowding out of the market, a crowding out where you shift too much money into a small pocket of projects. And we see this point in Europe and other parts of the world where there has been a yield compression in, for example, renewable energy. And what happens is that, you've got to be very selective what you buy in wind or photovoltaic. And then it's more about quality. So to fix this is really open up the project stream and encourage corporates to transform and innovate. I think the innovation, and you mentioned a couple of interesting industries, it's not about as much as we need a taxonomy for green. But I think we as investors, for example, we just simply look at a corporate where it is, where the business strategy is, and is it innovating? What share of capital expenditures goes into green products, investments, low carbon technology? What share of R&D goes into innovation, right? That's the future, and you don't want to be backward looking. You want to see where corporate is on the trajectory towards a low carbon world. The political signals are extremely clear. The instruments are very helpful coming forward. So taxonomy, for example, sets an interesting side product. The side product is if you look at the carbon efficiency thresholds we define for the various activities, and you can benchmark your own corporate or an industry where it stands. So take automobile. So taxonomy says 50 grams of carbon dioxide emission per kilometer. If you look at fleet averages of many car companies, they are at 130. We got the 95 gram coming forward in 2021. If you don't meet it, there are fines. But also with the taxonomy, there's a bit of see it as a risk signal and how fast you have to transform. And disruption is key. And sustainability disruption also means automobile sector is a good sector. There's new technology, e-cars, hydrogen, where does it go? But in the end, as I said, it is about not threatening corporates. Corporates need a bit of time. I think it's very important to talk to treasurers, strategies, see the C-suite in corporates, where they are, what they plan, what they need. And then also we, and as investors, of course, we can go in a dialogue or we can give positive loans in the bank sector. I mean, reduce the coupon by achieving sustainability objectives linked to taxonomy, for example.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open up for questions any moment while I ask the ambassador a really mean question, which I would have asked the Prime Minister if he was here.
You wouldn't do that, would you?
I would. Well, I'll ask you a question because I think the Prime Minister would appreciate it. And that is, Latvia has also very strong ambitions in the area of zero carbon. How are you going to pay for it?
Why do you think we are discussing this now? No, very clearly. I mean, the EU MFF, next EU MFF will be crucial for us. So we will be looking, of course, at getting the financing right, what comes from the EU, for what type of projects and what type of industries. We have a strong financial sector in Latvia, that is one thing, and they already implement the sustainability standards by the UNEP and so on and so forth. So they're very well aware that there will be a major part from their side also in this move. So when we look at the renewables, we are far ahead of the average in the EU already, but we have to move to 40% in 2030. So there is a plan. There is a very concrete plan. The issue will be transport, especially private transport, the cars. You know, how do you get to change user habits, which is as much as, you know, what incentives do you use and so on and so forth. Energy efficiency is good, so in that respect we'll be fine. But it costs a lot of money. So our national effort, EU financing, and the industry are the three elements we are looking at. And the industry in a wider sense, because again, what type of loans for what type of companies will be classified as green, how not to make it too complicated for the SMEs, not to impose inadequate burden, to make them flourish, how to involve the civil society so that they actually support with their knowledge, how to involve research and development, which are doing very well currently in Latvia already on these subjects. So it's a real network. I think Latvia is a sort of laboratory currently how to get it all going. So if we get it right, I think everybody can get it right.
We should all come to Latvia to have a look.
Well, on this, if I may add a couple of points. Indeed, if you look at the case of Latvia already now has the lowest CO2 emissions per capita in EU 28 and somewhere second or third highest share of renewables in energy mix in EU 28. So I'd say if the whole EU would get as far as Latvia, we would have been already quite advanced.
You see, this is the meaning of my question, to give you the opportunity to point out what a great job Latvia is doing. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to open up for questions in the audience if we have some. I know there's some at the back here. Yes, please. If you could say who you are and your institution, and then speak into the microphone. Yes, thank you. I'm not sure it's on. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
It's on now.
Now it's on.
It's on.
I'm interested to know what you think the biggest gaps are remaining in disclosure requirements and how they could be fixed.
The biggest gaps in disclosure requirements and how they could be fixed.
On disclosure requirements, we briefly discussed it already. In a sense, we see that currently we are relying to a large extent on non-binding reporting guidelines. So first thing is to make this disclosure framework more binding. Then indeed we will be looking how to expand it across different sectors of financial sector, different parts of financial sector, and potentially into also non-financial sector. So basically, this will be exactly one of the work streams in a next Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which we'll be putting forward next year.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
Sila Barash at Bloomberg News. Vice President Dombrovskis, in your remarks, you talked about extending equivalence for access to UK clearinghouses. How long will that be extended for, and will it be time limited?
The question there is, in case you didn't hear, is how long could the equivalence be extended for?
Well, it's to be decided. Currently, what I can do now, basically, to announce this intentions that we will be working on this, given the fact that the current equivalence determination expires on 30th of March next year. But there is another point which I would like to very much emphasize. It's industry's preparedness. So one shouldn't expect this being, extended and extended and extended again. So there will be also a strong focus on actually industry doing its part in mitigating this systemic risks to the financial stability.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, here in the center.
Claire Burgess, Clifford Chance. Thank you very much for those presentations. I had a question on the taxonomy and the use potentially in future legislation. We've heard the technical expert group describe the taxonomy as a comparative tool, and we've also heard people apply the standards in terms of transition financing with a slightly more nuanced approach. Whereas often in legislation, the sort of binary approach to in or out works quite well when you're trying to, allocate potentially a green supporting factor or anything of the like. How do you see the taxonomy being applied as a comparative tool or more of a binary test?
I think that's one for Steffen. Do you have a bash at that?
Well, first of all, I think taxonomy as a binary tool is probably too strict. So it is, too digital. So I think what we need to accept is that, as was mentioned, a lot of activities, can be, I think, clearly put into a green bucket. But there are others that are in between and on transition. So, a comparative approach, benchmarking towards most efficient practices in a certain economic activity are key. I know that's been quite an intensive discussion about, and I think often misunderstood, for example, when you compare taxonomy with science-based targets, that rather ask corporates to put out a plan how they decarbonize their business activities in the next years and how much greenhouse gas they aim to reduce. I think both are, in the end, compatible. I think that's misunderstood in their application. I think what we have to see is how the market practice really evolves around that. To be honest, I think it's a bit too early. But in the end, it's comparative.
Maybe just expand upon that, because for those of you who are not familiar with the taxonomy, one of the hallmarks of it is that it says banks and institutions should not disengage with current carbon-intensive industries simply because they're carbon-intensive. So please engage with them and then persuade the transition to go in the right direction, rather than just take them out of your portfolios and stop all lending. So BP, Shell, the big cement, Lafarge are all, to me, speaking very interesting stories about the way they want to see their own business go, which makes them part of the transition, therefore an acceptable part of the financing strategy. Vice President, I should allow you to comment on this more, but it seems to me it's a hallmark of the taxonomy is that it does permit that. It doesn't say just stop financing all.
First of all, to be clear, taxonomy is not compulsory in a way that it's not prohibited to lend to economic activities which are not compliant with the taxonomy. So from that point of view, taxonomy is there to define what economic activity is green, to facilitate, to shift from more political activities to more green activities. But it's not prohibition to invest, say, in coal if someone decides to do so. And then indeed, this taxonomy, as already discussed, is granular. There is taxonomy which is green, there is transition activities which are described, what they can be, there are enabling activities. Indeed, it's built in the way that it can support already economic activities which are, if you want, aligned with the Paris goals, and then beyond potentially on climate neutrality, and economic activities which help us move towards that direction.
Thank you. Make that clear. Yes, at the back and then here at the front.
Good morning. Fiona Wright from the Brunswick Group. The Vice President mentioned a new action plan that we should expect sometime next year. And obviously the Commission has said they will respond to all the areas that were covered in the high-level group report of last year. Can you say anything else about the other elements besides the non-financial reporting that has already been discussed that we can expect to see in this new action plan? Thank you.
Actually, I already mentioned some of the elements in my speech, maybe to reiterate some of the points. So first, we indeed need to finalize the work of taxonomy because this is a basis for many new activities. So based on taxonomy, we can develop EU green bond standards, we can develop EU eco-label for financial products, to start with retail financial products, but potentially to move to other other financial products. We can move to the green mortgages, define green mortgages, for example, and see how we can support those green mortgages. European Banking Authority is already assessing, well, what can be done in terms of prudential treatment to support this green transition. So it's going to be quite a comprehensive action plan.
Thank you. And here, I think at the front.
Good morning. Yang from Xinhua. My question is about the cooperation with China. What are the opportunities do you see for a country like the UK, Latvia, and other European countries when China is promoting further opening up and is making more efforts in the green and sustainable development? Thank you.
Well, maybe to start with the last part of the question on sustainable development, certainly we see China as an important partner, as the world's second largest economy, and actually the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Of course, any global effort to fight climate change needs China on board. And from this point of view, we welcome China's commitment to Paris climate change goals. We welcome now China's engagement in International Platform of Sustainable Finance, also to work in this area of financial sector. And more general, so we continue to work with China, for example, towards investment agreement, investment partnership, seeing more opening up in area of investment. So from EU side, we will continue to engage closely with China.
I might also mention the EU and London have been working together with China through the Green Finance Committee there, both on shared standards, on implementation of TCFD, and particularly on the green investment principles for the Belt and Road, which has been a major piece of work, which now has some 35 banks and institutions signed up for these green investment principles, and that's been something we've all been working on. Thank you very much. Mark.
Mark Folliott, I'm the Latvian Honorary Consul in Hertfordshire. A question about Brexit, which we've managed to avoid so far. The British government made clear it will wish to diverge from European Union standards after it leaves the European Union. Is this an area where Britain should seek to be as closely aligned as possible, or to go its own way? And if it is to be aligned, how is this to be achieved with Britain being outside of the formal mechanisms of the European Union?
Vice President, I fear that's for you also.
Well, yes, I would say we have I outlined the EU approach to this issue already in quite some detail. So first, we would rely on a system of equivalence determinations between EU and UK in the area of financial services. Well, it's sector by sector, it's legislation by legislation, it's unilateral, so that both sides preserve their regulatory autonomy. So those principles had been outlined already. Then I would say in terms of those equivalences, it should not be overly complicated, given that we start from the same point, because currently EU legislation is in place in UK. So from that point of view, if UK does not engage in deregulation or starts shifting away from EU's regulatory framework that is, I would say, a completely feasible basis for work. At the same time, we have outlined also EU's approach on equivalences. So a couple of elements which are important. First, that we see it as a granular approach. So in a sense, if markets are of more systemic importance for the EU, we expect larger degree of alignment with the EU. So it's, we must see what kind of potential systemic risks or risks to financial stability we are, in a sense, potentially importing through equivalence determination. So the more systemic the relationship, the closer alignment we would expect. And second, that in terms of equivalence determinations, we also have a framework on so to say, ex post monitoring of compliance with equivalence conditions. So in a sense, if we have equivalence in certain area and later, well, the third country decides to diverge regulatory or is not following up with the developments in EU, we can withdraw the equivalence. And actually there had been in the last couple of months the first precedents where we had actually doing so, where third countries were not following the regulatory developments in the EU. So that's a basic approach how we intend to cooperate in the area of financial services.
Thank you. We've got time for two last questions. I think I'll take them together if I may. One here and Alan at the back.
Tom Burke from E3G. Achieving a net zero Europe by around the middle of the century means that effectively we'll have stopped burning gas. That means we'll have stopped importing Russian gas. Is that good for or bad for European security? And shouldn't we perhaps be also thinking about strengthening our relationship on decarbonisation with Russia as well as China?
Indeed, once we move to the carbon neutral economy, fossil fuels will not be part of the picture. So, as we were discussing before, natural gas may play its role in transition towards carbon neutral economy if we are shifting for more polluting natural fossil fuels like coal, for example, but eventually we would move out of the fossil fuels, including natural gas. In fact, for example, European Investment Bank just a couple of days ago, if not yesterday, when was it, announced that as of, if I'm not mistaken, 2021, it will not further invest in natural gas. So in a sense, we see that banks are already moving away from natural gas, and one of the reasons of what EIB was putting forward is the risk of stranded assets, that they do not want to invest in assets which potentially can get stranded as EU continues to decarbonize its economy.
Ambassador, do you have a comment on that also?
Also, you know, when we look at the Latvian side, you asked specifically question on the Russian gas and Russia as a partner. Obviously, there are two sides to it. It depends on Russia itself. And, you know, when we look at the Latvian situation, obviously the diversification for the energy was one of the issues that came along with the security issue. So for us, it was not only, you know, per se fossil energy and the energy mix, but also the security. So there is a larger aim always in diversification and moving to renewables. So that was a choice that Latvia made. So.
Alan.
My question is, we've heard Commission officials talk about the taxonomy must be based in science, but have political consensus and also work with the grain of the market. So three conditions, but they could be contradictory. And I'm thinking of nuclear. I mean, the science says one thing and the politics in some countries says another. Which would win out in a debate?
Nuclear power.
Yes,
actually, yes.
Sure. I mean, clearly, when building a taxonomy, again, that evaluates real economic activities and technologies, to be precise, you get at stretch points. So gas was one. I think even the one that probably was not as reflected as strongly as nuclear power in the media, but is the bigger one. And nuclear power, of course, we have, as you know, different opinions between member states. Sure, I mean, there is no golden answer to it. I mean, it's a negotiation process in the end. I mean, there will be legislation coming forward that will be driven by the member states in the council, which I cannot comment. It's a political process and should not comment. I mean, what happens, I think what I say from an investment perspective and somebody who uses the taxonomy going forward for financial products is that I expect it to be dynamic, so taxonomy is not carved in stone, you know, and there will be, whether it's nuclear power currently at the attention, there will be other technologies like carbon capture storage, pressuring carbon dioxide into the ground is also another technology that's heavily debated, whether it produces positive effects or negative effects. We will always have this. This is in the nature of taxonomy. So I think what will happen is there's a dynamics around it. There's a continuous technology progress. And again, I know that people in the energy industry, they point at all the innovation in energy power. But still, you know, how to fix, say, the waste side of nuclear power is not properly solved yet. So you can argue back and forth, and there will be trade-offs. And there is no yes, no answer in my view. It will be dynamic, and that's the nature of taxonomy.
On that note, I think, unfortunately, we have to finish because we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Vice President. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Steffen. Very much indeed for participating in this. There's lots more to talk about, and there's lots more to take forward. So if we could say a round of applause, please. Thank you.
Just before everybody leaves, as Policy Chair at the City of London Corporation, it falls to me just to say a final few words to round this morning off. We've been very pleased to hold this here this morning. I'm delighted to see all of you in the audience, but a particular thanks to our speakers today and to the panel for that very interesting discussion just now. Of course, we're fully aware that the relationship between the UK and the EU is going to change. And right in the middle of this election campaign, it's perhaps even more uncertain, if that's possible, to know what the future relationship will be like than it is when our Parliament is actually sitting. But whatever happens, we recognise the importance of continued cooperation and engagement between the UK and the EU. And in that context, can I warmly welcome your announcement, Vice President, on the question of temporary equivalence for UK clearinghouses. What you've said about extension will be very good news for for the financial sector generally, and for the 14 trade associations, some represented in this room, who wrote to you on this very important issue just yesterday. I think we all recognise the need to be realistic about financial stability and about the need for preparedness, and so your comments just now will have been well taken and heard. And cooperation and engagement is, of course, going to be very important also on the key questions that we've been discussing this morning, particularly around sustainability and green growth, global challenges which are going to require international cooperation at European level as well as at global level for us all to meet. And we're absolutely determined here in the city to play our part. This is, of course, a city and a sector which has a strong track record in this area, with the Stock Exchange having seen the first issuance of, the London Stock Exchange having seen the first issuance of a certified green bond, and numerous other developments here in the market. That's why we helped Treasury to set up the Green Finance Institute earlier this year, which Roger chairs, to champion sustainable finance in the UK and beyond. We want the city to become an engine of the transition to a low-carbon economy, a global hub for green investment and also for green arbitration, accounting and technology. But in all that, it's absolutely vitally important that we work in partnership across borders, that, to go back to your comments, Ambassador, we don't have silos in this important area. And we hope that continuing to work with Latvia and with our other EU partners will help to contribute to a shared approach at global level so that we can really work together to meet the challenges, but also to take advantage of the opportunities for sustainable growth across Europe. So another thanks to our panel, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.